Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Bonjour à tous ceux et toutes celles qui sont en ligne. Ils sont nombreux, merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'introduire l'axe consacré à l'Éthiopie dans le cadre de ce colloque sur la Bible en ses réceptions africaines. Alors, pour plus de facilité pour nos intervenants qui parlent anglais, je continue en anglais. Ethiopia holds a singular place in the history of African Christianity. It is one of the oldest Christian kingdoms, as we saw in the opening lecture. To briefly recall, the Christianization of Ethiopia, or more precisely of the kingdom of Aksum, dates back to the 4th century, under the reign of King Ezana of Aksum. Ethiopian Christianity presents several distinctive features. Today, it is primarily led by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which has played a central role in Ethiopian society up to the present day. The term Tewahedo means being unified, referring to the belief in the unified nature of Christ, both divine and human. Although the Ethiopian Church is historically connected to the Coptic Church of Egypt, it has developed its own liturgy, its own education system for both clergy and laity, its own monastic tradition, its own religious music, and its own tradition of biblical commentary and exegesis, as we will see in the various presentations. In addition to producing its own works, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has also encouraged the translation of texts written elsewhere, particularly from Greek, and from the 13th and 14th centuries onward from Arabic. The Ethiopian biblical canon is both flexible and extensive, including works such as the Book of Enoch, for which we are fortunate to have distinguished specialists with us today. A key element of this tradition is the Ge'ez language. Ge'ez is an ancient Semitic language, like Hebrew or Arabic. It was very early employed for the translation of the scriptures and for the development of a vast body of religious literature. Its writing system is itself distinctive. Ge'ez is also relatively close to Arabic, with which it shares a number of phonetic, morphological, and grammatical features, likely due to early contacts between Ethiopia and South Arabia. Interestingly, the term Tewahedo is linguistically related to the Arabic Tawheed, a central concept in Islam. Although, in that context, it refers to the oneness of God rather than to the nature of Christ. Despite these similarities, however, the two languages also showed significant differences, particularly in their everyday vocabulary. Ethiopia does stand at a historical crossroads between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. This position fostered early contacts with the broader Semitic world and later with emerging Islam. According to Islamic tradition, Ethiopia was a place of refuge for the first migrations of some of the companions of Muhammad, who were received by a Christian ruler, often identified as the Negus. This episode illustrates an early history of contact, coexistence, and mutual reconnection between Ethiopian Christianity and early Islam. Close connection between Ethiopia and Israel are also emphasized in Ethiopian tradition, particularly in the famous Kebra Negest, the glory of the kings, written down in Ge'ez in the 13th century. This text recounts that the Queen of Sheba had a son with King Solomon, Menelik I, who is regarded as the founder of the Ethiopian royal dynasty. Educated in Jerusalem, he is said to have introduced Judaism upon his return to Ethiopia, accompanied by priests and teachers of the law, and to have brought the Ark of the Covenant to Aksum. These connections with Israel are also reflected in certain Ethiopian Christian practices, such as the observance of the Sabbath, dietary purity rules, and circumcision. Today, Ethiopia remains a religious, diverse country. Christianity is the majority religion, predominantly in its Orthodox Tewahedo form, alongside a significant Muslim population, as well as Catholic and Protestant communities. One may also mention the historical presence of Jewish communities, often referred to as the Beta Israel or Falashas, which further reflects the religious diversity of the country and the long-standing presence of traditions related to Judaism in Ethiopia. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Mersha Mengistie, from the Center for Ethiopian and Eritrean Studies at the University of Hamburg. His research focuses on Ethiopic philology, liturgy, and biblical commentary. Thank you for being with us today. You have the floor.
Okay. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, in English, which I'm deciding to learn French for the next conference, at least. So thank you so much for the introduction. And my title is, I don't think, oh, this is, yeah, Authorship as Exegesis, the reception of biblical authors in the Ethiopian Andamtā commentary tradition. Ethiopia is credited not only in translating the Bible into Ge'ez much earlier, but also crafting a commentary tradition called Andamtā. Of course, prior to Andamtā, as I'm going to tell you, there was another form of commentary tradition called Trugwame, and Andamtā is the current and living commentary tradition in Ethiopia. So it's not moving, right? No. All right, no problem. Yeah, probably as you have read from my abstract, I aim to show how authorial introductions in the Andamtā tradition function as key exegetical frameworks for interpreting biblical texts. We have this commentary tradition, and at the beginning of the corpus, we see the commentator defining the name of the author and explaining his sainthood and so on and so forth. So to achieve this objective, I've outlined three questions. The first question is, how are biblical authors introduced in Andamtā commentaries? As I said, Andamtā is our commentary tradition. How biblical authors are introduced in the Andamtā commentary. The second question is, what interpretive function do these introductions serve? Why are they defining the author's name and so on and so forth? They have a purpose. It's not just to introduce a kind of narrative of the author's life. The third question is, how does this practice shape the reading of the biblical text? It shapes. I mean, it brings the attention of the reader into the text. So these are the three questions. And I will try to introduce, because apart from Badanil and some of you and my friend from Ethiopia, most of you might not have the information about this commentary tradition. I will tell you a bit about the commentary tradition we have in Ethiopia. And then I will directly delve into the topic, biblical authors as exegesis, how and why. As I said, Ethiopia has its own commentary tradition, and it's not a very recent tradition. We had the Ge'ez by Ge'ez commentary tradition. We translated the Bible into Ge'ez, and we were trying to elaborate the mystery or the message of the text in Ge'ez. So the Ge'ez text by Ge'ez. This commentary tradition is called Trugwame. It's an earlier commentary tradition. And then when Ge'ez become, as people say, dying or on his bed, we started to comment manuscripts or texts in Amharic, the current vernacular of the country. So that is called Andamtā. Andamtā is the name for the commentary tradition. Of course, this commentary tradition went through different revisions. And because of the revisions, there were school of thoughts created or happened, the so-called Library, upper house, and the lower house. But my main focus is not narrating the tradition, so I will be brief on explaining. So the Library tradition is more of, the ancient, how Andamtā was an oral tradition. In the school, if you go to Ethiopia today, the ecclesiastical education system, the learning teaching system is oral, predominantly oral. The teacher teaches orally, and the student need to capture everything orally. Of course, because of the introduction of publication, printing technology, and that tradition become challenged now because everything is published. So the student doesn't need to put everything in his mind. So if a student of Psalms, for example, Psalter, in the former days, he had to put all the 150 Psalms chapters into his mind so that he can, perform. So because of the revision, the Libet, the earlier one, as I said, Andamtā was scribed, written in the Gondaraim period in the 18th century. Before that, it was oral, as I said. And somebody by the name Esdros, a very traditional scholar, came, and we need to revise the Andamtā. It's a very amorphous corpus. We have to revise it. We have to shorten it. There were people who opposed his initiative. There were people who accepted his initiative. This division created two schools of thought in the Andamtā tradition, the Libet and the Tashbet. In the content, there is no difference, but the Tashbet is smaller, shorter, and very precise. The Libet is more of Ge'ez-oriented, Amharic, and so on and so forth. So we have these two traditions. Of course, the dominant one in our country is the so-called Tashbet, the lower house, the revised tradition. So, Andamtā, probably if you know the language, it means andam. Andam meaning there is one who say. He reads the first chapter, the first verse of the chapter. For example, the first verse of the book of Genesis. He puts this verse, and then he follows all the commentary traditions. As he interprets, as he gives more explanation about the verse, the mystery or the content of the verse, he used this term, andam, and again, and again, and again. It's because of that style that Andamtā become the name of the tradition. So Andamtā is a model of exegesis in Amharic that permits the exegete to interpret in turn singular verses or phrases of a sacred text with several possible complementary explanations or commentaries. So it's, the longest explanation of Andamtā optional interpretation is 17. For a given verse, he gave 17 alternative interpretations. So, it swims through the mystery of Christian literature to explain text. It's an Ethiopian commentary tradition that replaced the Ge'ez by Ge'ez commentary tradition, as I said, and it was born as a literary heritage during the Gondaraim period by the initiative of Emperor Iyasu. And it went through partial and comprehensive revision as I said, by Esdras and so on, the so-called Leibet and Tashbet. Andamtā, this tradition, this commentary tradition, what makes Ethiopia unique is most of the traditions are living. We are not saying about something which passed, which is no more practiced. The Ethiopian tradition, we have education, schools, Andamtā schools, commentary schools, where students, if you go to Gondar now, at this time, you find piles of, a room full of students with a teacher commenting. So the teacher comments, interprets, the student try to memorize and put what they learn in their memory. So in the scholarship, in the ecclesiastical education, this tradition locates or situates at the top of the education system, the last one. We begin, I just concluded a project about this tradition, and it's a very interesting African education system. We call it Abnet, and it starts from reading lessons. We call it Newab Bet, reading school, and then we move to the Zema Bet, the church music and art, where students learn church music and art. And then the third stage is the Qanebet. The Qanebet is a Giz grammar translation composition of verses. Students, they philosophize. This is a very, very sound stage of education. And then once students finish the Qanebet, they move to the Mersha. So Mersha is the commentary, the interpretation and analysis of scriptures. This education stage has 4 departments: Old Testament, Department of Old Testament, Department of New Testament, Department of Scholars, the books of scholars, and the 4th one is the Department of the books of monks. This is organized into four departments. And as I said, in the Gondarine time, it was written down. The Andamtā was written down in a way I described it to you, in being divided into 4 departments. The Old Testament, we have 35 books of the Bible, and we call it the Old Testament, the Bluat. Blue means old. And the second one is New Testament. We have 46 books. We have different biblical canon in Ethiopia, so 46. And the book of scholars, we have 8 books which are commented in this department. 8 books that, some of them are from the patristic fathers like Cyril, Kerlos, and Hamanotābo. It's a composition of patristic literature. Taxas, Qaddace Mariam, Udace Mariam, Fatana, these are the 8 books which are commented in this department. And the 4th one is the monks department, where 3 books are commented, interpreted, and learned. So, as a literary corpus, if you see, I wish I could, my folio was displayed on the board, but as a corpus, the Andamtā corpus has a structure. It has a standard pattern. When you pick a book, a commentary book, you find this standard pattern everywhere through all the departments. The first one is Maqdam, the preface. The commentator gives a very good explanation about the book, about the author, about the moral lesson in the text, and so on and so forth. And then he moves into the Zar, we call it Zar, where the Giz text, the verse, like as I said, Genesis chapter 1, number 1, or verse 1, is given. So that is the Zar, we call it the Zar, the Giz reading, and then the translator or the commentator translates that Zar, that Giz text into Amharic, so that people can understand what it is from the very beginning. So the Amharic translation of the Ge'ez text. And then once it is translated, the commentary comes, the commentary proper, we call it Trigwame. So the commentary proper is the section where we find all the gist of the verse, or the possible interpretations, as I said, introduced by the term Andam. And again, this means this, because of this, and this. Andam. And again, this means this, because of this and this. And he brings, stories and sayings from the desert fathers, for example. It's a very wide section where we find everything about the text. So my interest is on the Maqdam, on the preface, because it is in this section that we find about the author. So about the author, the Maqdam is known by different names. As I said, Maqdam, some say Tariq, some say Durhatata, which means course of explanation, or Tariq is story. Maqdam, as I said, is preface. It's known by different names, this section of the commentary tradition. And as I said, it functions as a structured hermeneutical entry point. Very structured and very well taught, well crafted entry point to the hermeneutical explanation and the book at large. And it established authority, embedded the text within sacred memory, and construct a symbolic relationship between author, book, and community, meaning the readers, and to prepare the interpretive horizon within which the text will be read. So this section is very important. And as I said, because I promised to say something about authorship as exegesis at this conference, so my focus is on the preface only. When we say authorship as the first step of interpretation, we find 4 elements in this section. The first one is an explanation of the author's name. For example, what's Enoch? Enoch, I will give you examples. When he starts commenting the book of Enoch, he starts by defining the name Enoch. What does that mean? What is the explanation that can be given for the name Enoch? So the first one is an explanation of the author's name. The second one is a description of the author's spiritual quality. What spiritual quality does the author has? So he gives, from different sources, he gives narratives about the author's spiritual qualities. And the third element we find in this preface is an account of the author's identity. His identity, being Christian, being a man of Bible, being someone who was chosen by God, and so on and so forth. The fourth and the last element is a transition into the interpretation of the text itself. After defining the author's name and giving his spiritual qualities, the interpreter, the commentator, tried to connect that section into the main commentary corpus. So it is a transition into the interpretation of the text itself. The first one is an explanation of the author's name. The first major feature of these introductions is the etymological interpretation of names. In many Andamtā commentaries, the author's name is explained through associations drawn from the Ge'ez language. These explanations are not purely linguistic exercises. It's not only linguistics. They are theological acts of interpretation. The meaning of the name becomes a key through which the author's vocation and the message of the text are understood. For example, when the name of a biblical author is interpreted as signifying gift or light or servant, this meaning is not treated as incidental. Rather, it is taken to reveal something essential about the author's divine role. A name meaning gift may suggest that the author is a bearer of divine revelation. A name associated with light may indicate illumination or prophetic insight. A name linked to service may highlight humility and obedience. In this way, the name becomes a condensed theological statement. It encapsulates the author's identity, calling, and relationship to God. As a result, the reader approaches the text already oriented by symbolic understanding of its attributed author. Once the reader reads something introductory about the author, he connects himself with the content of the text. The interpretation of the name does not simply precede the reading of the text, it actively shapes it. For example, the commentary of the book of Amos begins by defining the name of the author as follows. Let me read it in Amharic. Amos ማለት ጽኑ በእግዚአብሔር አንድም ጽኑ እግዚአብሔር አንድም ጽና እግዚአብሔር ማለት ነው. You know, አንድም it gives possible. አማዝ አዜቅ እንዲል አንድም አሞስ ይላል ውዱድ ማለት ነው. Let me translate this. Amos means firm in God. Andim firm God. Andim strength of God. As it says, Amos, Amas, Azek, Andim it says Amos. It means beloved. As you know, the book of Amos is a prophetic text that delivers a powerful message of divine judgment and social justice, primarily addressed to the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE during the reign of Jeroboam II. In explaining the name of the prophet, the commentator seeks to illuminate the nature of the message he proclaims. As reflected in the name, ጽኑ በእግዚአብሔር, firm in God, the prophet emerges as a steadfast voice calling for justice and integrity. He famously condemns those who observe festivals and offer sacrifices while neglecting moral responsibility. Moreover, he warns that Israel's privileged status as God's chosen people does not exempt them from judgment. Rather, it heightens their accountability. Almost all of the explanations of names we find at the beginning of the Andamtā commentary materials reflect the same notion. We can list lot of examples. It's more or less the same, this formulaic approach. The second element is hagiographical framing, the spiritual quality of the author. A second key feature of this author-related introduction is a description of author's spiritual qualities in a sort of hagiographical framing, explaining their identity, deeds, combats, miracles, etc. Within the Andamtā tradition, authors are not presented merely as historical figures situated in a distant past. Rather, they are portrayed as spiritually exemplary individuals whose lives participate in sacred history. Their biographies are narrated in ways that emphasize holiness, divine election, perseverance, and intimacy with God. For instance, an author may be described as having undergone trials that purified his faith, or as having received divine visions that authorized his message. Such narratives do not function as neutral historical reports. They are interpretive constructions that highlight the author's sanctity. Through them, the authority of the text is reinforced by the holiness of its attributed author. It's, probably the hagiographical tradition imitated this tradition from the Andamtā. A comparable dynamic can be observed in the introduction to Enoch, which provides a clear example of this hagiographical framing. Enoch is not presented merely as figure of distant past, but as a spiritually exemplary individual whose life embodies holiness, ascetic, discipline, and divine intimacy. The commentator begins by interpreting his name as renewal. Enoch means renewal. Immediately positioning him as a counter figure to Adam. Whereas Adam brings corruption through food, Enoch restores through fasting. This contrast constructs Enoch as an ascetic saint whose life participates in salvation history and authorizes his role as a bearer of revelation. This sanctity is further developed through narrative motifs, still in this section. Enoch's withdrawal from human society and his choice of the law of angels mark him as a transcending ordinary human existence, while his concealment in paradise signifies divine election. His life is explicitly read in typological terms. His dwelling in paradise prefigures death, and his entry into it resurrection. The contrast with Abel reinforces this, presenting Enoch as a figure of hope over against the fear introduced by death. At the same time, the failure of the descendants of Seth, interpreted as a warning against ascetic decline, highlights Enoch's steadfastness as exemplary. Even the discussion of the book of Enoch's marginal canonical status ultimately affirms his prophetic authority, particularly through its citation in the Epistle of Jude. In this way, the introduction to Enoch exemplifies how the Andamtā tradition constructs authors as holy figures whose lives authenticate their texts. The author thus becomes not only a source of revelation, but also a model of spiritual imitation. I can read you the whole section, but it's lengthy, so this is a summary at least. The third element is author's identity. In modern Western literary criticism, as we know, there is a concept called the days of the author. They say days of the author, where a text is analyzed completely separate from who wrote it. The Andamtā framework entirely rejects this, as we said. It argues that a biblical book is not just a floating piece of literature. It is a profound expression of a specific person's lived spiritual experiences. Therefore, you cannot truly understand the message without understanding the messenger. Within the Andamtā framework, the meaning and content of the book cannot be fully separated from the identity of its author. The author functions as a hermeneutical key to understand who the author is, to understand how the text should be read. That's why they are serious in giving much detail about the author of a text before they offer their commentary proper. For example, a text that emphasizes repentance may be linked to an author whose name is defined for penitence, as an example of Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. Daniel means ፍትሐ እግዚአብሔር, ዳኛ እግዚአብሔር. Some texts rich in visions may be associated with an author described as a seer. A text marked by wisdom may be connected to an author characterized by discernment. In such cases, the identity of the author becomes interpretive, generative, and it provides a lens through which the themes and message of the text are understood. A hermeneutical key is the primary lens or tool used to unlock the deeper meaning of a text. In the Andamtā tradition, the author's biography, vocation, name, and spiritual state are the key. If you read the Psalms without knowing about David's profound sins and deep repentance, they are just poems. But when David's identity as a penitent king is the key, the Psalms become a theological roadmap for confession. 5 minutes, okay. If you read Amos without knowing he was a ragged working class shepherd, his anger might be just seem like political ranting. But when his identity as a man farming God and an outsider is the key, his words become a divine indictment of elite empty rituals. This is exactly why traditional Andamtā commentaries usually begin with a lengthy introductory section called Magdum. Before the teacher even touched the first verse of the biblical text, they spend a significant amount of time establishing the author's identity, lineage, historical circumstance, and even the etymology of their names. In short, in the Ethiopian exegesis, biography is theology. Biography is theology. It's not just introducing someone. It's a theology by itself. They outline the theology which is embedded in the text they are going to comment on. So the author's identity, as it is discussed in the preface, dictates the text's interpretation. The author versus the text, the last element we find in this section. The fourth important element concerns the construction of a symbolic relationship between the author and the text. In many Andamtā commentaries, the author's moral character, spiritual experience, or divine mission is presented as being reflected in the content of the book itself. The author and the text mirror one another. To illustrate this point, one may consider the introduction of the Psalms as a representative example. In what is termed Gibra Hatata, act or deed of explanation, the commentator introduces the authors of the text, David. However, as becomes clear in the passage cited below, the commentator does not merely provide a definition of the author, rather he established a connection between the author, the content of the text, and ultimately the author's divine election. Let me read just part of the introduction. The introduction is as follows. Explanation concern, I'm reading the English translation of the preface of the commentary. Explanation concerning the righteous and the sinners. David is interpreted as heart of God. As it is written, I will appoint shepherds after my own heart, and he will seek shepherds after his own heart. Another interpretation states that David means chosen, as in the verse, and I exalted my chosen one above my people, as it's written in Psalms 88, verse 19. Yet another interpretation renders David as peacemaker or a reconciler. The phrase explanation concerning the righteous and the sinners is not counted as an additional 11th Psalm title, rather it is considered together with the Psalm concerning David's son Solomon. If one inquires into the reason for this, one account of David's anointing at the hand of Samuel, 7 gifts were bestowed upon him. If one asks what these were, they are as follows. And this list of gifts you find in the Psalms. The first one is the gift of kingship. The second one is the gift of priesthood. The third one is the gift of power. The fourth one is the gift of victory. The fifth one is the gift of playing the harp. The sixth one is the gift of healing. The seventh one is the gift of prophecy. So these are gifts and contents you find in the content. Why people or commentators give this section? What is the hermeneutical implication of this? Taken together, these elements, etymology, hagiography, identity, and symbolic linkage, demonstrate that authorship in the Andamtā tradition functions as more than introductory information. It operates as a structured hermeneutical entry point. The explanation of the author's established authority frames interpretation and situates the text within a broader theological and communal context. This approach also reveals fundamental characteristics of the Andamtā method. Interpretation begins not with textual analysis alone, but with relational positioning. The reader is first introduced to a sacred figure whose identity shapes the interpretive encounter. The text mediated through the persona of its author. This has several important implications. First, authorship becomes a means of establishing textual authority. The credibility of the text is grounded not only in its content, but also in the sanctity and divine calling of its attributed author. Second, authorship embeds the biblical text within the sacred memory of the church. By linking authors to hagiographical traditions, the commentary integrates scripture into an ongoing narrative of holiness that extends from biblical past into the present life of the community. When you read some of the hagiographies, you find really some extracts from this section into hagiographic tradition. So it's a recycling content. And the third, authorship constructs a symbolic relationship between author, text, and the reader. The reader doesn't encounter an isolated document, but a living tradition mediated through a revered figure. The act of interpretation thus becomes relational and participatory. Let me conclude. In conclusion, the Andamtā commentaries demonstrate that discussion of authorship serves as a powerful theological framing devices through the interpretation of names, the construction of hagiographical narratives, and the symbolic linkage or the symbolic linking of author and text, the author becomes a hermeneutical gateway. This introductory section established authority, embedded the text within sacred tradition, and shaped the reader's engagement with the scripture in profound ways. The Ethiopian reception of biblical authorship, therefore, represents a distinctive and sophisticated interpretive approach, one in which authorship is not treated as background information, but as the first act of interpretation. In the Andamtā tradition, authorship itself becomes exegesis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. We have discovered the Andamtā tradition, very special. You have certainly some of questions, but we will take questions after all the three presentations. So keep your questions on mind until the end, please. Thank you.